The problem with their message is that their story begins in the middle, not the beginning. When this law was first passed and the people began to give their information to the registry, there was a simple belief that the law stood for something. There was a leap of faith that had to be taken by the people of this state, a willingness for the citizens to expect this government, who designed its own rules for administering the program, would at a very minimum do three things. One, protect patients' privileged information. Two, implement and manage a program. Implement and manage means something other than a 7-month delay in processing applications. And three, provide for the administration of new conditions being added to the registry. This is what was promised to the citizens who voted for this law. This was the agreement, the contract between the citizens and government. You go through the certification process, your doctor approves you, you pay your money to the state collects the fee, they cash your check, and you're supposed to get a card. You get your card 7 months later, and the card is supposed to stand for something. It's supposed to mean something, and it's supposed to protect you against arrest, prosecution, and any penalty. And it protects your privacy as a patient and as a caregiver. Instead, what we've seen is a failure, tremendous failure, one that goes beyond the normal government bureaucracy, one that may be able to be explained as most politicians do, but not in this case. Now when there's a positive surplus of $10 million of revenue brought into the state from the program just from application fees. This money is still unaccounted for. This money has been described by the legislatures and the judiciary, and I'm quoting now, to be a public nuisance. I have one question. How can we take you seriously? One of the most offensive of the pending bills is SB 377. This is a requirement that patients and caregiver information be provided to the Michigan State Police, who will then disseminate it to the local police agencies. One part of the promise for privacy is not being understood. What this proposal does is remove the protections of privacy guaranteed by this law. And I ask you, what other sick person is required to register their information with law enforcement? The answer is none. Then you have SB 418, a bill proposed to eliminate civil remedies for those who violate the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act. Meaning when your rights as a patient or caregiver are violated by the government, you will have no recourse, no relief, and you will not be able to sue. Why, I ask, are we talking about bills that take away the very basic rights that all Michigan citizens have? Why is there an attack on this community? What are they afraid of? And again, I have one simple question. How can we take you seriously? You are blatantly and without remorse ripping the people of the state of Michigan off. And yet, you have the audacity to complain, criticize, and propagandize a community of sick people. Not one penny of the $10 million has been spent to train, educate, or even suggest a different way to view this community. How can you in good faith? How can you with a clear conscience? How can you with any honor say that this government has even the slightest attempt made to implement this program? People are still getting arrested all over the state for not having their cards 3 years into the program. The website, the Laura website, gives information that says, do not bother us, do not call, your calls will not be returned, and we're working on applications from February. And I ask you, how can we take you seriously? And yet here we are, looking at more bills that not only create rules for a select class of people, but a principle that was very clearly outlined, which is called equal protection under the law. These bills ask patients of this community to put a big sign on their back and target. These bills look to create more ways to arrest sick people. Beyond the medical marijuana community, this is a flat-out attack on democracy. They tell you when you're a little kid, if you don't like the law, go out and change it. Well, the voters did this with overwhelming support by 63%. And I want to know who gave them permission to try to change this law. Those critics have called this law confusing, broad, gray, unclear, Swiss cheese. Recently, our Attorney General announced his plan to save the state. And it was to enact laws to prosecute doctors for certifying patients who don't deserve to be patients. This was on the same day the stock market dropped another 600 points. I want to know who gave this state employee permission to do this. The people of the state of Michigan are sick of the waste and destruction of its valuable and dwindling resources being spent to arrest patients and caregivers. Amongst the other decrees, 63% of the voters of the state of Michigan demanded that sick people be allowed off the battlefield of the lost war against drugs. Yet here we are, and I have one simple question: how can we take you seriously? Now, as a lawyer, I've heard the worst of it. I get the bad calls to my office, the violation of patients' and caregivers' rights and the constitutional violations. I'm reminded of one case of a client of mine whose house was broken into, his home was invaded. They stole his property. He was at the last rally. He's very sick now. His name is John Bagley. He's a hero to me for his courage in coming forward and telling his story as he has so many times. And after John Bagley's house was broken into, he called the police to report that his house was broken into. And you know what the result was? He was charged with a crime for having marijuana in his house and having plants in his house, all within the limit. And he was charged with having a gun, mandatory 2 years in prison, which was registered, and he had a permit. What was my client John Bagley supposed to do? Should he have gone and found some street justice? Is this the message? Is this the message patients are supposed to get? That they don't have the same rights as anybody else? If they get robbed, don't call the police? That it's foolish that to call the police and think that reporting a crime isn't going to get you in trouble? Is it too much to ask law enforcement to protect patients and caregivers? Is it too much to ask for equal protection under the law? Instead we've seen the worst. I hear law enforcement say things like, "You don't look like a patient." What does a patient look like? Pain, suffering does not have a face. Prosecutors all over the state are filing motions and judges are granting motions that don't allow patients, people accused of crimes, from using a medical marijuana defense in front of a jury, and not allowing the attorneys to mention medical marijuana or the patient's cards. They're keeping the truth from the jury.